Today, we're welcoming merger Robert Tolan to the podcast. Robert got a grant from Emergent Ventures to start a think tank on Irish housing policy. He's also a founding fellow in the Polaris Fellowship and is now working on an exciting new project. The topics we discuss range from how to write great cold emails, the impact of reading the Homebrew Computer Club, and his thoughts on the housing theory of everything. It's a great conversation. Enjoy. Hey, Robert. Really excited to jump right into this conversation with you. You're a really interesting guy for a lot of reasons that I'm sure we'll get into in a second here. But to kick things off, I think it would be really interesting to kind of like turn back the clock and talk about a little bit sort of what got you into all of this in the first place. What was sort of your life looking like at that time? What were your inspirations? What were your motivations of wanting to jump in?
So I was working in a bank in London, and I hated it. So I left and took a year out. I've got a bunch of stories about my time where I worked, but maybe that's for another time. Didn't know what I wanted to do next, and I emailed somebody called Ben Southwood, who works in Stripe. He's part of their Works in Progress publication. And I said that I was looking for projects, and that led to me working on housing policy. I got an Emergent Ventures grant to start a housing policy think tank focused on Ireland. And I also got backing from Entrepreneur First through their Polaris Fellowship. I did that for a year. I got a co-founder that works on housing policy full-time now. And I'm back in finance in a sovereign wealth fund in New York City. So I've kind of gone full circle, but I'm working on side projects at the moment. And yeah, that's pretty much me.
Robert, I'd be super curious to hear what was that like when you messaged Ben? Is it somebody that you had met sort of at an event, or did you have some sort of prior, you just cold emailed him? So what was that like? Yeah, share that experience.
Well, because I had done so many cold emails up until that point, honestly, I do care if somebody ignores my email, but my feelings won't be hurt if somebody ignores me. So I just took a chance. I was really hoping Ben would get back to me. And it was really fortuitous because I ended up meeting somebody called John Myers through that email. And he gave me an awful lot of mentorship and guidance that I hadn't really gotten up until that point. So I would encourage anybody to just cold email as many people as you can, politely. And even you can cold email me and I'll probably get back to you. So, yeah.
Talk about that for a second. Like, what do you think is an element of elements of a good cold email? A lot of people send very bad cold emails.
Yeah.
I'm sure you get them. I get them all the time, Ari too. What are elements of a good cold email? What were the things that you would send as a young person to people who had tons of experience and were making a lot of progress on their things that would get them to respond and be interested?
So I've made every cold email mistake you can make because I've sent so many cold emails. So the first thing I would say is don't be afraid that the first few are duds. That happens. I think what makes a good cold email is that you show succinctly you're an interesting person, you're smart, or at the very least hardworking, and you show that you've done some background research on the person you're emailing. There's nothing worse than getting an email addressed to you that's actually addressed to somebody else. So, which has happened to me, and it happens, as you guys know, to a lot of co-founders and founders with cold emailing, and they just go straight into the bin. You want to have a good hook to draw somebody into your email, and then you can kind of go from there. Maybe because I'm Irish, I'm probably good at storytelling, the cold emails come a bit naturally, but I think it's something anybody can do.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why are the Irish so good at storytelling?
I was reading about it recently, and I think, I've thought a lot about it, and I've read a lot about it. I just think it's just an important part of national kind of psyche. I mean, there's a long time, my family lived in poverty up until the 20th century. So all they had was stories. When that's all you have, you've got to get good at storytelling. My father had 14 siblings. So when you had airtime in the house, you had to use it well and you had to be engaging. So I probably got it from my father's side.
And going back to when you were sending out those cold emails to those first people, what was the hope on your end for those? Did you know that you wanted to get into housing policy, or were you more looking for just like opportunities in general? Tell me about that.
Opportunities in general. My mindset is that you should be open-minded and willing to give anything a try. I had done housing economics as part of some of my university studies. I did maths and economics in college. Not that college matters, but that gave me some exposure to housing. So I had a good grounding. But I think there's a big difference between the economics of something and the public policy side of things, because you've got to engage stakeholders in a fashion that's not obvious in economics papers. I think at the time when I met Ben Southwood, and I went on to meet John Myers, I mean, they're both so impressive. I would have worked on anything they told me to. That's pretty much the nuts and bolts of it.
And so, what was that experience like? Speaking with these two guys and learning about sort of the work that you could do for them. You mentioned that they were working on Stripe Press, so I assume that part of the work that you were doing for them, on housing policy, was writing.
Yeah.
What was that opportunity like?
Well, at the time, I had been doing some freelance work at The Economist during my year out. So I ended up in that job through a cold email too, which I can talk about that story also. But when I got in touch with Ben, he had just said that they were looking for people that could do projects and could work well independently and were creative. And I didn't know what the project was until I spoke to John Myers. And that's when I found out it was about housing. At the time, I was at home with my parents on the family farm, and I couldn't get somewhere reasonable to live at a nice price. So I guess I was thinking about housing a lot at the time. So it was a pretty easy sell.
I'd be curious to have you walk us through sort of the intersection of like writing about these things and how that translates into changes in policy. Obviously, the writing about this space came before you're later going on to raise non-dilutive funding to start your own think tank on housing policy. How do you think about that transition and how they impact each other?
The first thing I would say is that you can have a really good idea, but if you can't write about it and you can't sell it, it's absolutely useless. So you have to be able to write or tell stories in an engaging fashion. You've got to be succinct and to the point. You've got to still maintain a lot of honesty, I think. And you've got to build trust when you tell that story or write about it. So for me, the writing has always come naturally. It's something I've always enjoyed. I think it's something everybody can do.
When you were reaching out to folks and kind of figuring out what you wanted to work on, and it kind of ended up being this housing is kind of the topic, what were you saying about your background and your interests that kind of helped them give you feedback on maybe places or ways that you could apply yourself?
I think my pitch was pretty much grew up on a dairy farm. I spent some time in horse racing before university. Which that was kind of, as part of my hook, that's always been an important part of it, because it's not every day you get an email from somebody from that background. And that I was in the bank and absolutely hated it and was willing to do anything as long as it doesn't involve working with psychopaths. And that was pretty much my pitch. And you'd be surprised how many people that actually appeals to.
Well, the frankness definitely helps. I think that a lot of people won't be as open about that. And when you show that, it might actually kind of give people the sense, wow, this person really, really wants to get out of there, and they're going to work really hard to find something.
Yeah. And also, one thing I experienced was those negative reactions. And I think for anybody, that should be like a red flag. I think if you can't be authentic and frank with somebody nowadays, I think that's a very bad sign. I think you should be striving for authenticity all the time. In a world where like so many things are so fake, you've got to go against the grain. When I've gotten bad feedback about being like open and honest, to me, I kind of think that's just saving me time down the line. I don't want to deal with that person anyways if I can't speak my mind. So, yeah.
Maybe we could transition to talking a little bit about the think tank.
Yeah.
So you started this think tank. What was the premise behind it?
So the idea is that it's inspired by this housing theory of everything. So you can take most Anglophone economies, in fact, all of them, and trace almost all of their problems back to shortages of housing. It's been proven empirically that the easiest way to solve housing shortages is to increase supply. And it sounds to me pretty intuitive, but there's an awful lot of people out there that think it doesn't make sense. But so my basically pitch was researching the potential of supply side policies in Irish housing and then selling them. So that was the premise. I knew that when I started out, and I think one of the reasons I got Emergent Ventures funding was that it has such a high probability of failure. So I knew that the risk reward wouldn't be appealing to most people, but it was something I was willing to try because I think it is important to give things a go.
And so I would love to have been able to sit in on the conversation between you and Tyler Cowen for receiving that grant. For people who may not know, he's a famous economist. What was that conversation like? You mentioned sort of speaking with openness and frankness about your ideas. What was that dialogue like?
So first of all, I didn't know it was actually an interview for Emergent Ventures, so there was absolutely no pressure. So we were kind of talking about. I got an email from him that he wanted to speak to me, and I thought this is just a regular conversation. I did some preparation because I've been a big listener of the podcast, but besides that, I went in with no expectations. We spoke a bit about some of the modelling I had done for one policy called street plans, how I went about that, my thought processes behind the methodology, and just kind of random stuff about myself, what it's like to grow up on a farm, whether or not we may have been related, because of course he's from an Irish background, so it's always possible. And then he just said out of the blue, would you like X amount of dollars? And it was a lot of money for me at the time, so I didn't say no.
That's amazing. And so, I mean, from what I gather, this was your first time starting a think tank. How does one go about starting one, and what does it mean to start one? What does a think tank do on a sort of very concrete day-to-day basis?
So I think to do it properly, you've got to register in any jurisdiction you're in as a think tank, which is what we did. The way it works is you just go to the kind of company's house in your country, and you can form a limited company, which is what we did. And you kind of go from there. So you've got your legal entity, and then you've got a researcher or two, and you can do think tank work really any ways you like. There's no kind of framework. There's been really successful examples like the Adam Smith Institute in London, the Institute for Progress. Those two, I think, for me were frameworks that I wanted to follow. When I started out, didn't really have much funding. I had the EV funding, I guess, which was a lot, but in the context of think tanks was kind of a drop in the ocean. There's a lot of money involved in public policy. And I had Google Earth, Google Maps, and Google Images, and a calculator, and a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, and that was how I got going with research.
Maybe you could share a little bit more about the housing theory of everything. It's one of those topics that, yeah, to me, it also sounds quite intuitive. That makes sense, and that's sort of the thing that drives a lot of the other challenges that we have in the world, or at least in towns and cities. Yeah, say a little bit more about it.
So it's pretty much the basic premise is that every public policy problem is fundamentally a housing issue. So if you think about things like labor mobility, family formation, health, it's all traced back to housing. So for example, when you think about startups, you have kind of knowledge economies, or you get these talent clusters that form easily when housing is abundant, which is what happened in San Francisco prior to the 1980s. It was really easy to get a place to live, so you could just get on a plane, go there, and start a company pretty much within a week. But nowadays, you've got to spend months looking for somewhere to live, which delays things massively, and it makes it more unlikely that you'll meet a co-founder or somebody working on the next big thing and find that $1 billion idea. in terms of family formation, people spend so much time saving for overpriced homes that they leave starting families until later in life. So naturally, their kind of fertility window is smaller and they have less kids. And then in terms of like health, we've got like pretty much low density urban areas in most English speaking countries. So it means that you get this urban sprawl phenomenon, which leads you to driving more. Whereas if you were in a high density area, you could just walk everywhere. So they're kind of three simple examples of how housing shortages affect your life in cruel and unusual ways. But it's pretty much most of the thinking behind housing shortages comes from the idea that it's really England's fault because they actually created legislation that just put a stranglehold on supply. And that's when we got housing shortages in a modern context. I think the light at the end of the tunnel is that we haven't always had housing shortages. Like they're just a recent phenomenon that we can actually fix pretty easily. And there's like loads of examples in America of doing that, like accessory dwelling units have been a great policy that have been successful.
Yeah, and in Austin in particular, I know that they're making some pretty significant progress on ADUs, accessory dwelling units. If you were to try and steelman the other side of this, I'm super curious because it's really easy to write off people who are anti housing theory of everything and say, they are just emotional about the topic, and there probably is some emotion there, to be sure. But if you were to try and like steelman the logic and sort of the case against this theory, what would you do?
So one of the kind of critical papers behind the housing theory of everything turned out to have a coding mistake. So the actual findings were slightly wrong. But luckily, there are two other papers that found that actually increasing housing supply works with respect to reducing housing costs. So typically, detractors of the housing theory of everything point to that one paper that had a slight mistake. But also kind of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard in general, says that when you increase supply, developers are more likely to build more profitable forms of housing. So they actually end up pushing up the average cost of accommodation in areas, which actually has been, frankly, it is actually true in some local instances. And then generally, people are resistant to change. I mean, particularly in Dublin, they don't want anything above 8 stories, which is in the context of a cosmopolitan city, to me, kind of unbelievable. But that's kind of the psyche there, that anything high will block out the sun, create a really ugly urban area, which is actually, I get that perspective. I mean, if you look at modern skyscrapers, they're pretty, in a lot of the cases, they're pretty ugly. So we've got to start building big beautifully. And a great example of that is the work of an architect called Etienne Louis Boulet, who kind of thought about building these huge megastructures very much inspired by nature and natural proportions. So you can actually build really big things and make them look really good. I think to fight that strand of NIMBYism, we've got to put more of a focus on aesthetics and beauty in architecture, which is, I'm very interested in urbanism. There's a great Twitter account by a guy called Samuel Hughes. He kind of tweets about housing all the time and how to make it look good. So I recommend that you check him out.
We're going to have to link to a bunch of these resources in the show notes here. So anybody who's listening, check out the show notes. We're going to include them. There's something really interesting about what you said, which is just sort of aesthetic beauty and also just change, right? I think that the reality is people are terrified. A lot of people are terrified of change, or they really like the way things are or the way that things once were. And they just don't want to see that change. The change might have already occurred. It might not actually be how it once was, but they still are holding on to the fact that it's kind of how things once were. And I think that, it seems in some ways that there's and I, I'm very pro housing. I think that there is oftentimes a lack of empathy for the people who are worried about change or things like that, that kind of potentially negatively impacts the ability to make progress because there's almost this dismissive strand to the discourse. Or, I mean, even something like this NIMBY YIMBY thing can kind of create these labels that are a little bit like inflammatory in some ways. There's a person in Merge, Mohammed, who is working on creating more monuments, and he believes that creating these really interesting and powerful monuments is a way to sort of rally the community, inspire people, that sort of thing. And we can link to what he's working on. Hopefully, we'll have him on the podcast soon.
I spoke to him in the past, before I joined Merge. So I really recommend checking him out.
Yeah, so things like that I think could be really impactful. So maybe we should pivot the conversation. You worked on this think tank, you launched it, it's still running, but currently you're kind of exploring what's next for yourself. How are you thinking about that? What are you thinking about?
I'm really interested in community building and large language models, which I guess sounds kind of generic now, to be honest. But I'm interested in both of those things. I've recently started a small project with my friend Connor Broderick. So we're creating the anti-80,000 hours jobs board for the Irish tech industry. So there's a huge supply and demand imbalance for software engineers. So we're trying to make the market more efficient through using large language models to match candidates and jobs. So it's something that we think can get you a pretty respectable ARR. I think it's important with your projects to make money or to have a reasonable chance of making money. And that sounds, I know some people like way too capitalistic, but I think in reality, like your time is valuable. So like the emphasis has got to be on making money. Whereas when I worked on the think tank, I got a lot of exposure to like thinking creatively, fundraising, finding a co-founder, building something from scratch. But I didn't get exposure to actually commercializing something, which is what I want to do now.
Do you think working on something that maybe wasn't profitable but enabled some more creativity, better set you up to then go on and build something that was profitable in the future? Or was there not really a relation there?
I think there's a relationship for sure, because when you're working on something that's fundamentally a non-profit, you have more excuses to speak to a wider array of people, I think. So you get to expand your network like really fast, and you don't have to worry about actually selling somebody something. So I don't think there's as much pressure. So for me, it helped me meet more interesting people, definitely improved the way in which I can see the other person's perspective. So there is a relationship for sure. And I think it's something that's worth giving a go.
And so now you're working on this exciting sounding project with a co-founder. What do you see in your next 6 to 12 months? Are you wanting to go all in on this? Are you wanting to work on other projects with other people? Where does your focus lie?
So for me, I hope it'll be part of a portfolio of projects. So I'm currently in New York City on one kind of visa, and I hope to get an O1. So I need a portfolio of projects. To prove I'm an extraordinary alien, I've got to jump through all kinds of hoops. So that's the plan, is to do a bunch of projects, hackathons, that kind of thing. And yeah.
Super cool. And I mean, as far as actually the visa goes, like walk us through like what that process is like. There are tons of people who are building really amazing things and are wanting to move to the States to do it. So obviously you mentioned, needing to get these projects under your belt. What else is a part of that process? What are these hoops that you're forced to jump through?
You've got to do a bunch of things, including you're proving you're paid more than the average person. So you're kind of inherently worth more. You've got to, like I mentioned, prove that you're of extraordinary ability. And the issue, I think, that term is like so broad. It can mean anything. It makes for a confusing process. So I guess for me, it's about like proving I have something to offer to America. At the moment, I got really lucky with my employer that they've sponsored me. So I didn't have to go through a really crazy process. But, the O1 will be great to flex.
Gotcha. Pretty interesting. I actually think it might be useful to backtrack a little bit and talk about sort of Emergent Ventures and the Polaris Fellowship that you went through. Some people, listening, obviously are interested in your background, but might also be thinking about applying to these programs. We spoke a little bit about Emergent Ventures already, but what was it like applying to Polaris? What was sort of the value proposition? How did you find out about it? Maybe we could start from sort of linearly, hearing about it and then applying.
I mean, the whole thing was so insane. It was like the most enjoyable thing I've ever done. So I found this like randomly online, and it was kind of pitched as an experimental program run by Entrepreneur First. And the advertisement gave a kind of Stanford prison experiment vibe. So I thought I definitely wanted to apply to that. And I applied, and I got talking to the founder, Arno Schenk. And he asked like it was a challenging interview for sure. He asked like a lot of random questions, like really trying to understand my personal philosophy and what motivates me. And then we had to do an in-person dinner to prove you have some social skills. And then he basically made a decision on those kind of factors. And it was great. You get to take part in a reading group, which I found very helpful. It like totally changed my perspective on so many things. You get £10,000 to spend however you like. And I think the best thing is the fellows you get to work with. Where I went to university, it's kind of full of normies, whereas on this fellowship, it was just full of like the most extraordinary people that were working on like really big ideas. So that was the kind of first time I had been exposed to that kind of person in a kind of a more intimate setting.
Robert, did you say a reading group?
Yeah. So it was an experiment to see if you could take someone that meets certain criteria, that criteria is basically that they seem pretty credible, hardworking, maybe they're smart, and to see if you could make them be high agency. So we were given a reading list to kind of show us that you can literally do anything. You don't have to follow the rules. You can make your own rules, which for me it was. Before I started the reading list, I thought, it's not going to change my mind. But then when I read the books and got to engage in discussion with people, it totally changed my perspective.
Wow. We might need to just copy this directly from Merge. This
is
such an interesting idea. What do you recall any books or ideas that particularly resonated with you?
So I can send the book list on. And you can share it. It's not a secret. I guess what stood out to me was I was very attracted by the kind of homebrew computer club stuff that we read. I hadn't really I hadn't known of them, but I hadn't really thought about them in depth. But when we started reading about kind of San Francisco, the kind of origins of modern computing or technology, I took that all for granted until I read the books that dealt with those topics. Probably the book that stood out the most was The Friendly Orange Glow, which I recommend, and The Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe, about hippies, psychedelics, and how they played a role in modern computing.
I was really not expecting those books. I mean, I know the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. It's a Tom Wolfe classic, and there's such an interesting overlap between the hippie movement and the early computing movement, which is funny because of the fact that there was so much of this was military. The early computer stuff. So there was this sort of overlap between the military and the hippies. I suppose a lot of them actually were given LSD as part of military experiments to start. So maybe that's part of the connection there as well. But what would you say, those aren't necessarily books that I would connect with agency or kind of the ability to go and to sort of forge your own destiny. I suppose that in some ways the homebrew computer club almost feels more like people who are doing stuff not for the goal of building businesses, but they're doing it for, pursuing their own curiosities, right? Which I suppose is kind of what the grants are for, right? In general, right? Emergent Ventures. How do you think about that relationship between people pursuing sort of curiosities and then these things actually leading towards, businesses or like really impactful projects?
So I think the way I think about it is in a kind of a really bland consumer society. It is actually pretty radical and high agency to say, I actually want to satisfy my curiosity rather than watch Geordie Shore or Love Island. It's actually pretty radical to take a step back and say, I want to build a nuclear fuser, which my friend did in his back garden. To me, that's high agency. Does high agency mean it's got to be kind of what you're working on? It's got to be done for altruistic reasons? I don't really think so. I think the recent Homebrew Computer Club seemed to be more of a function of curiosity rather than making money, was simply because of the ages of the people that were involved. They were like more idealistic, and I think as they got older and they got more realistic, money starts to become a part of their utility function.
Gosh, that's super interesting to think about, because I wonder how much that has changed, or how much of that stays the same. I think that back then it feels like money didn't become as much of a thing for people early on as maybe it does nowadays. And obviously there are a lot of people who are pursuing their curiosities, and it's amazing, especially people in Merge who are pursuing all of these interesting ideas, and they're not necessarily thinking about a commercial implementation of it. But it definitely feels like we're skewing more, maybe as a society, towards, hey, how do I monetize immediately versus how do I pursue my interests? Does that seem accurate to you? Or do you think we're moving more in that direction? And if so, is that a good thing, bad thing, or is it just a thing we should accept and sort of act on?
So I think there's a really strong correlation between that skew and housing costs. So I mean, the thing is, a lot of people end up having to make money to pay rent, which is actually like a pretty recent phenomenon. It's only really a 40-year-old phenomenon. I mean, in the 70s, rent was really cheap. You could work on whatever the hell you wanted to work on, and there was kind of no huge pressure. But whereas now there's pressure because you have to pay exorbitantly high rents. So I think that causes the skew. Do I think it's a good thing? I think nowadays where speed is really critical, I think it is a good thing. But I wonder sometimes, does it inhibit the creation of like really original, radical ideas? I think some things had to be done slowly, and I think those ideas potentially have the highest impact, and in the long run could make more money.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really like perfect place to wrap up the conversation. Robert, thank you for joining us and being frank and open about your thoughts and opinions with us. It was great speaking with you, and I think people will really enjoy listening to the conversation.
Oh, thanks very much.
And the last thing I'll say is it was incredible, wide-ranging. We covered so much ground, so many interesting resources to link to in the show notes here. And then also people should hit you up. You are sort of actively exploring new things. You are very open to good cold emails. So let's make it happen. Hopefully this will attract some really interesting folks your way.
Fingers crossed. Thanks, guys.
Well, that was awesome. I really didn't know what to expect when we were talking to Robert. He's got a really interesting background, but I would have never guessed that we'd cover such ground. Everything from talking about why the Irish are such good storytellers to talking about the housing theory of everything to what it's actually like to start a think tank. It was pretty crazy. And I think that the thing that I really loved is how he kind of went full circle at the end there and got back to talking about, hey, why are people so focused on monetization and like making money as influencers or content creators versus sort of pursuing their curiosities. It's like, well, look, rent isn't cheap anymore. We are not in a place where you can just go and sort of explore your interests and be able to have, a decent, way of life. It's much more like you need to make money and you need to make it soon. He's even talking about that himself, right? He's talking about, hey, I need to think about how do I make money with my next thing. It's less about sort of exploring the curiosities. And, I think that in some ways, these grant programs kind of provide a little bit of a financial cushion, but also encouragement to pursue curiosities instead of just going off and trying to immediately do something that is commercialized and is focused on revenue from the early days.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I met him for the first time and we spoke briefly earlier this week on a call, ahead of getting him in the Merge community. And very selfishly, I, after about 10 minutes of speaking with him and very lightly touching on a lot of the topics that we spoke about in this podcast, I really wanted to have a chance to hear more. And so really glad that we could find this time to speak with him. And I personally learned a ton. I think you're absolutely right. Like just drawing these parallels between, rent prices and that building up pressure for people to work and to be able to pay those rent hikes. It's very interesting stuff. And the role that grants play in this is interesting because, we spoke with him about how he got his start receiving grants to work on projects that weren't necessarily profitable and how in their own way, it ended up setting himself up better in the future for building things that do make money and are very profitable, and having that time to sort of, think a little more openly, think more creatively, explore more, I think is super interesting. And he's not the only one who's taking this path, and it seems to be working out very well for a lot of people. So really great conversation. And excited to see what he does next with his new co-founder and his new project.
Something that's really exciting is this idea that we're recording the first podcast episode with a lot of these people who are coming on the Merge pod, right? And I think that's really cool because, there are a lot of podcasts who have these incredible guests who've been, kind of like the podcast hits. If you have Balaji on your podcast, people are going to listen, right? It's Balaji. He's very famous. People like to hear the new take, right? Totally makes sense. But at the same time, there's something really special about being the first person to record somebody. And ultimately, some of these people are already working on just incredible things, right? But what are they going to accomplish in the years ahead? Hopefully people will be able to look back on these podcast episodes and be like, wow, that was when they were just sort of getting started, or it was impressive what they were working on now or then, but wow, look what they're working on now, right? So I think there's just something really exciting about kind of being the first for a lot of these people when it comes to podcast episodes. And what a great job he did. He didn't seem nervous at all, and he did a great one. So looking forward to recording more of these. Awesome stuff.